I know if we're going to win this, we've got to scrum forwards, forget the backs. We've got to take them on, take all their emotion. It sits in their forward pack. Andrew Sheridan is one of the strongest, most powerful human beings I've ever met. But when he doesn't want it, can be a little bit wetty.
Phil Vickery built a career on collisions. Every time he stepped onto a rugby field, he knew somebody across from him wanted to drive him backwards, expose his weaknesses, and leave him questioning whether he belonged at the highest level. For nearly 2 decades, that challenge never disappeared. If anything, it became even greater as his reputation grew. Nicknamed the Raging Bull, Phil Vickery earned respect the hard way. He was never the fastest player on the pitch, nor the most naturally gifted. Instead, he became one of England's most feared tight-head props through relentless work, remarkable toughness, and an appetite for confrontation that few forwards could match. From his early years with Gloucester to his successful spell at Wasps and his role in England's 2003 Rugby World Cup triumph, Vickery built a reputation as someone who would never take a backward step. Yet rugby supporters often misunderstand players like him. Props rarely become famous for spectacular tries or dazzling runs. Their greatest battles happen where television cameras struggle to capture every detail. Inside the scrum, inches determine reputations. A single collapse, one dominant shove, or one lost engagement can define an international career. For players like Vickery, respect was earned in those brutal exchanges, not through headlines. Although he later captained England and became one of the game's most respected figures, his career was anything but smooth. Serious injuries repeatedly threatened to end it. Selection battles created enormous pressure. Every Six Nations campaign, and every test against the Southern Hemisphere, brought another opponent determined to prove that England's famous number 3 could be beaten. Phil Vickery has never been known as someone who publicly declared hatred toward other players. Those who played alongside him describe him as honest, hard-working, and fiercely loyal. But that does not mean there were no rivalries. Throughout his career, certain opponents pushed him harder than anyone else. Some challenged his place in the England squad. Others tested every ounce of his physical strength. A few represented everything England desperately wanted to overcome on rugby's biggest stages. These were not personal feuds built on insults or controversy. They were rivalries forged through repeated collisions, unforgettable scrums, and matches where pride mattered as much as the final score. Here are the 5 people who brought out the fiercest side of Phil Vickery's remarkable rugby career. Number 5. Os du Randt. Few front-row players understood the brutal art of scrummaging better than Os du Randt. By the time Phil Vickery established himself as England's first-choice tighthead, the South African veteran had already earned a reputation as one of the greatest loosehead props the game had ever produced. Their meetings were never about flashy rugby. They were about survival. South Africa's entire forward pack has long been built around physical dominance, and Os du Randt was one of the biggest reasons for that identity. Standing well over 6 feet tall and carrying enormous strength through his shoulders and hips, he possessed an almost unmatched ability to generate power in the scrum. Unlike many props who relied purely on brute force, du Randt also understood body position better than almost anyone. Every angle, every bind, and every inch of leverage mattered. For Vickery, facing him meant preparing for one of the longest 80 minutes imaginable. Whenever England met the Springboks during the early 2000s, much of the contest centered on whether England's front row could withstand South Africa's relentless pressure. Television viewers often focused on the backs, but experienced rugby supporters knew where the real battle was taking place. Every scrum became a personal contest between 2 men determined not to give an inch. Vickery later acknowledged that du Randt was among the toughest opponents he ever faced. It was not because the South African sought confrontation away from the ball. Instead, it was because every engagement demanded absolute concentration. A single technical mistake against someone of du Randt's quality could lead to a penalty, lost territory, or even shift the momentum of an entire test match. The rivalry reached another level during the years surrounding the 2007 Rugby World Cup. South Africa's forwards imposed themselves on nearly every opponent they faced, eventually lifting the Webb Ellis Cup. Although injuries limited Vickery's influence during that tournament, the physical standard established by players like Os du Randt remained the benchmark England's front row tried to match. There was never public hostility between the 2 men. In fact, mutual respect only grew with time. But if Phil Vickery was asked which loosehead prop consistently made his job miserable, Os du Randt would almost certainly be near the top of the list. Every meeting reminded England's raging bull that even the strongest prop could be pushed to his absolute limit by an opponent who mastered every detail of the front row. Number 4. Julian White. The hardest rival is not always the man wearing a different jersey. Sometimes he is standing beside you in training, fighting for the exact same position. That was the reality Phil Vickery faced throughout much of the 2000s with Julian White. Unlike many famous rugby rivalries, there was no public argument, no heated exchange in the media, and no lingering personal dislike. Instead, there was something far more uncomfortable. Every England squad announcement meant that only one of them could usually start at tight head prop. White had built his reputation at Leicester Tigers as one of the most destructive scrummagers in European rugby. He was uncompromising, technically outstanding, and feared by opposing front rows. Coaches valued him because they knew exactly what they would get every weekend. Physicality, consistency, relentless pressure at the set piece. Vickery offered something slightly different. While equally tough in the scrum, he contributed more around the field, carrying the ball aggressively, making tackles, and leading through sheer determination. As his leadership qualities became more obvious, he eventually earned the England captaincy, but that did not end the competition. In fact, it often made the pressure even greater. Every time Vickery returned from injury, questions immediately surfaced. Was he still England's best number 3? Had Julian White overtaken him? Could England afford to leave White out of the starting lineup? Those debates were constant among supporters and journalists. The rivalry became particularly intense because injuries repeatedly interrupted Vickery's career. Neck problems, back issues, and other physical setbacks forced him out of major matches, giving White opportunities to cement his place. Each time Vickery fought his way back into the squad, he was not simply trying to regain fitness. He was trying to convince coaches that he still deserved to wear England's most demanding shirt. Competition inside an international squad can sometimes be tougher than facing an opponent across the halfway line. Training sessions were fiercely contested because every scrum served as another audition. Neither player could afford to ease off, knowing selectors were watching every engagement. Despite the pressure, both men remained consummate professionals. They respected one another and understood that England benefited from having two world-class tight head props pushing each other to improve. Still, if there was one player who constantly threatened Phil Vickery's place, challenged his confidence, and forced him to raise his standards year after year, it was Julian White. Their battle was never about personal animosity. It was about earning the right to represent England, and in international rugby, there are few rivalries more demanding than that. Number 3. Graham Henry. Not every difficult relationship in Phil Vickery's career happened across the scrum. Some of the greatest tension came from inside the England camp itself, where expectations were just as unforgiving as any international opponent. When Graham Henry took charge of England in 2008, the national team was still searching for stability after reaching the 2007 Rugby World Cup final. Vickery had inherited the captaincy and was expected to lead a squad trying to rebuild its identity. On paper, it looked like a partnership that should have worked. Henry was one of rugby's most respected coaches, while Vickery was admired for his honesty and work ethic. Reality proved far more complicated. England struggled to find consistency. Injuries continued to disrupt Vickery's career, while performances swung from encouraging victories to frustrating defeats. Every poor result increased the scrutiny on both the coach and the captain. As captain, Vickery often found himself answering difficult questions that were beyond his control. Reporters wanted to know why England looked disorganized, why the attack lacked fluency, and why the team seemed unable to regain the confidence that had defined the World Cup winning generation. Henry faced criticism for his selections and tactical direction, while Vickery carried the burden of explaining those struggles to the public. The pressure created an uncomfortable dynamic. Henry demanded high standards and expected experienced players to set the tone every day in training. Vickery embraced that responsibility, but he also knew that leadership alone could not solve every problem. When results failed to improve, experienced players inevitably came under greater scrutiny, and the captain was always first in line. There were also difficult selection decisions. As younger front-row players emerged, England had to begin looking beyond the heroes of 2003. Vickery understood that no international career lasts forever, but accepting that reality is very different from living through it. Every injury, every missed match, and every squad announcement became another reminder that his place could no longer be taken for granted. Neither man publicly criticized the other, and there is no evidence of personal hostility between them. However, the relationship was shaped by enormous expectations, constant media attention, and the harsh reality of trying to restore England to the top of world rugby. For Phil Vickery, Graham Henry represented one of the most demanding periods of his career. Their story was less about friendship or conflict, and more about the immense pressure that comes when a proud rugby nation expects immediate success. Sometimes that kind of pressure can feel every bit as exhausting as facing the strongest opponent on the field. Number 2. Tom Smith. For English rugby supporters, few fixtures carry as much emotion as the Calcutta Cup. Form often means very little when England faces Scotland. Pride, history, and tradition have a habit of turning every collision into something personal. For Phil Vickery, those matches almost always began with one man: Tom Smith. The Scottish loosehead prop was never the loudest player on the field, nor the biggest. But among front-row specialists, Smith earned enormous respect for his remarkable technique. While many props relied primarily on raw strength, Smith understood leverage, timing, and body position so well that even heavier opponents struggled to gain an advantage against him. That made him an especially frustrating opponent. Vickery built his reputation through relentless physicality. He wanted to dominate the scrum, carry hard in open play, and impose himself from the opening whistle. Smith refused to let that happen easily. Instead of trying to overpower England's tight head directly, he often turned every scrum into a technical contest where patience mattered just as much as force. Their meetings during the Six Nations became some of the finest front-row battles of the era. To casual viewers, a scrum lasting only a few seconds might have looked uneventful, but former forwards knew exactly what was happening. Every bind, every foot position, every subtle shift of body weight was part of a chess match played under immense physical pressure. One mistake could concede a penalty. One dominant scrum could completely change momentum. That was why facing Tom Smith demanded complete concentration. The rivalry also reflected the wider battle between England and Scotland. England often entered the Calcutta Cup as favourites, carrying greater squad depth and higher expectations. Scotland, meanwhile, frequently embraced the underdog role. Players like Smith thrived on disrupting England's rhythm, especially in the tight exchanges where matches could be won long before the backs touched the ball. Neither player resorted to unnecessary theatrics. There were no famous arguments or public insults between them. Their respect for one another remained obvious throughout their careers. But respect never made the contest easier. Among the many loosehead props Phil Vickery encountered, Tom Smith consistently forced him to work for every inch. Their duels showcased everything that makes elite front-row rugby so fascinating. It was not about intimidation alone. It was about discipline, precision, resilience, and the determination to refuse even the smallest defeat. Those qualities turned every England versus Scotland meeting into another unforgettable chapter in one of rugby's oldest rivalries. Number 1. Carl Hayman. If there was one opponent who came to symbolize the highest standard a tight head prop could face during Phil Vickery's career, it was Carl Hayman. By the early 2000s, Hayman had become the cornerstone of New Zealand's formidable forward pack. Built like a heavyweight boxer but possessing remarkable mobility, he combined raw power with exceptional technique. Coaches around the world studied his scrummaging, while opposing front rows often measured their own performances against him. For Vickery, every encounter with Hayman felt like a test of whether he truly belonged among rugby's elite. England and New Zealand have always shared one of the sport's greatest rivalries. Whenever the All Blacks arrived at Twickenham, expectations soared. Supporters dreamed of upsetting the world's most feared team, but everyone inside the England camp knew that victory usually depended on matching New Zealand physically before anything else. That responsibility landed squarely on Vickery's shoulders. Unlike many props who preferred to conserve energy for the set piece, Hayman influenced every phase of the game. He carried aggressively defended, tirelessly cleaned out rucks with ruthless efficiency, and still produced dominant scrums late into matches. He rarely appeared rattled, no matter how intense the occasion. That consistency made him such a difficult opponent. For Vickery, there was almost no room for error. Losing ground against Hayman did not simply mean losing one scrum. It often handed the All Blacks valuable territory, confidence, and momentum. Against a side as clinical as New Zealand, those small advantages frequently became points on the scoreboard. The battles between the two men were never fueled by personal hostility. Off the field, both were respected professionals who understood the demands of life in the front row. But once the referee called crouch and the packs came together, friendship disappeared. Every scrum became a contest of pride, technique, and determination. Many rugby historians still regard Carl Hayman as one of the finest tight head props the game has ever produced. Competing against someone of that caliber forced Phil Vickery to perform at his absolute best every single time they met. That is why Hayman earns the top spot on this list. Not because Phil Vickery hated the man personally, but because no opponent represented a greater challenge. Every collision served as a reminder that international rugby offers no easy afternoons, especially when the player opposite you is one of the greatest front row forwards in history. For Phil Vickery, the defining rivalries of his career were never built on bitterness. They were built on pressure. Unlike athletes who fueled headlines with public feuds or controversial remarks, Vickery earned his reputation through the quieter, harsher reality of life in the front row. Every weekend brought another scrum, another collision, and another opponent determined to prove they were stronger. That was simply the job. The 5 names on this list each challenged him in a different way. Os du Randt tested his strength against one of the greatest loosehead props the sport has ever seen. Julian White forced him to fight for his own England jersey, proving that the fiercest competition can come from inside the same dressing room. Graham Henry represented the relentless pressure of leadership during one of England's most difficult rebuilding periods. Tom Smith turned every Calcutta Cup meeting into a technical battle where patience mattered as much as power. And Carl Hayman embodied the world-class standard every international prop aspired to reach. None of these rivalries were personal in the traditional sense. There were no lasting grudges, no dramatic betrayals, and no explosive confrontations off the field. Instead, they reflected something much closer to rugby's core values. Respect is rarely given freely. It is earned through repeated contests against opponents who refuse to back down. Perhaps that is why Phil Vickery remains so admired today. Supporters remember the bruises, the broken bones, the relentless commitment, and the determination to return after every setback. They remember a captain who led from the front and never asked teammates to endure anything he would not face himself. In the end, the men who challenged him the most also helped define his legacy. Without those battles, the Raging Bull would never have become one of England's most respected front row forwards. And perhaps that is the greatest irony in rugby. Sometimes the opponents you seem to hate the most are the very ones who shape you into the player the world will always remember.